So, Nathan, are you familiar with the 1876 election in the U.S.?
No, I'm not.
All right, prepare yourself for a massive shit show of an election that happened. So, for one thing, there was actually election fraud in that. Guess which political party was involved in the election fraud?
Democrats?
Yep. The way they did this was they were trying to trick voters that were illiterate at the time in some of the deep South states by, I kid you not, for the ballot for the Democrats, they had a painting of Abe Lincoln on the Democrat ballot there. Abe Lincoln at the time being a symbol of the Republican Party. Which they deliberately put to try to trick people into voting, people who were illiterate into voting for the Democrat. So, actual election fraud. Through misinformation to try to trick the voters, no less. It also got found that they were sending coded messages, something that Dev even himself had to admit in his 4-hour-long video, is that they actually were sending coded messages to try to bribe people to get even more fraudulent votes. But the coding messages weren't decoded in time, and they fucked that up.
Oh, that's great. You almost have to appreciate the balls on them for trying.
And they got fucking caught. And that's not the first time that the Democrats were caught trying to do that. They tried it in the 1864 election as well. Ironically enough, it was the same people It was the same people against changes to the voting okay, so 1864, right? One of the big changes they added there was the whole mail-in ballot process. The reason was for soldiers that were in the Union Army.
Mm-hmm.
So some of the Democrats were complaining that this was going to result in election fraud, which it did, because the Democrats did the election fraud and got fucking caught there too. But here's the thing, though. So you had all the nonsense with that going on in the 1876 election, to where it was the voter fraud there was enough that it actually technically did swing a few states in the votes. And then on top of that, one of the states, which was Oregon, which did actually go for the Republican candidate at the time, one of the electorates was was a postmaster, but because but your electorates in that state weren't supposed to work for the government. So he was just going to resign, right? Resign his post so he could serve as an electorate. The governor made sure he didn't resign, so he got disqualified. And the governor, by the way, happened to be a Democrat. And then the governor replaced him with an electorate that would vote for the Democrat candidate instead. So he basically stole an electorate vote that way for the Democrats. Now, that might not seem like that big of a deal, except the 1876 election was so close that the Republican candidate won by exactly one electoral vote.
Fucking one.
And the thing is, right, so this led to a constitutional crisis for very fucking understandable reasons. Because you had actual election fraud. The states that had the electoral fraud in them sent multiple slates of electors, because both the Republicans and Democrats, for various reasons, declared victory in those states. Republicans because when you counted the legitimate votes only, they won, and the Democrats because when you counted the fraudulent votes as well, they won. So that resulted in a constitutional crisis and a big compromise where the Republican candidate did ultimately come out ahead, but also some other stuff went on as well, right? But here's the thing. The Electoral Count Act itself came out in 1887, and a lot of people, like Dev, claim that it's just because they wanted to prevent another constitutional crisis and prevent election fraud. There's a couple holes in that theory. One, you might be wondering, why did it take them 11 years to actually pass new law? Well, here's the funny thing about that. See, 1887 marks a couple of things. First, you had, in the White House at the time, the first Democrat president since the American Civil War. Well, since Andrew Johnson, actually. So the first Democrat president since 1868. You also had, for the first time, Congress that was actually relatively blue. You had I think it was the House of Representatives that had for the first time really swung in the favor of the Democrats, and the Senate was just barely Republican, which means that if you flipped a few people from the Republicans over to whatever bill, you could get a bill passed, a Democrat bill passed, basically, right?
Yeah.
So keep that in mind. So the party that conducted the election fraud in 1876 was the one in charge for the first time, really, in 1887. The other thing to keep in mind is that the 1876 election wasn't the only case of election fraud. that the Democrats did. The 1872 election also saw election fraud, and enough so that it actually got a few states just not have their electoral votes counted at all. I think it was, I think Arkansas was one of them. I think either Mississippi or Louisiana was the other. But the point is, there was enough election fraud, and these states still did go for the Republican candidate at the time, but because the election fraud that was there, even though the Republican candidate won despite that, they still threw out the electoral votes for those two states. And for the record, also, the 1868 election, Democrat states, some of the states, such as Texas, were disqualified from that. In the 1864 election, you had Louisiana and Tennessee disqualified from that because they were Confederate but recaptured at the time. But the point is, the Democrats have been basically doing election fraud and all kinds of shenanigans for the entire time, essentially, in the lead up to 1887. And all of a sudden, they're the ones that make the Electoral Count Act. So that's the first hole. The second hole in this theory that it was made to prevent 1876 is the fact that if the Electoral Count Act was in play in 1876, the Democrats would have successfully stolen that election, because what it did was it basically meant that the state governor was the supreme authority on who is and isn't a certified electorate. So because that governor in Oregon swapped around one single electorate from Republican to Democrat, and the election was determined by one single vote, that meant that, that the Democrats would have successfully stolen that election had the Electoral Count Act been in play. You know, the Count Act that was supposedly meant to prevent that sort of thing from happening. But here's where things get really spicy. Are you ready?
Go on.
So, the Democrat Party, who up to that point had been frequently engaging in election fraud up to 1887, then in the year immediately after, in 1888, once the law had been set in that the states were the supreme authority on whether or not their electorates were certified, that's the year where they started putting in Jim Crow legislation preventing black people from being able to vote.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the year right after is when that shit started. Technically, they started putting in segregation laws before that, but when it came to voting rights, it's 1888 that really that actually started. So, if you think about it, which is something that, for the record, prior these kinds of laws would obviously result in the states getting their electorates potentially thrown out for obvious reasons. But now that the states are apparently the supreme authority on their own electorates, that results in a situation where they can't be challenged on if those electorates were gained under fraudulent conditions. Riley Munn says, in exchange for not rioting, the Dems demanded federal troops be withdrawn from former Confederacy. Yep, that is true. Republicans accepted the deal, and this led to... It did and it didn't, right? Like I said, there was some... it did lead to the start of some segregation legislation, though technically there were laws in the books to prevent that from the national level. But what really set the standards was the Electoral Count Act and Plessy versus Ferguson in 1892, that court decision. Riley says, another fact on the 1876 election, after the Democrats got caught trying to rig the election, they threatened to riot if Rutherford Hayes was inaugurated. Yeah, they did. By the way, the Hayes and the Republicans had basically the same plan in play for the 1876 election as the Eastman Memo, essentially. That was their big plan on that, just in case, something that Dev himself also has to admit, although he tries to pull some bullshit there too. But
hang on. After the Democrats got caught trying to rig the election, they threatened to riot if Rutherford Hayes was inaugurated. So if the Republicans won the election that the Democrats were caught trying to fucking rig, they would riot.
Yes.
Jesus Christ, what a repeat of history. When the hell have we ever heard that happening?
Even bolder, the Democrats were the ones trying to claim that the Republicans had stolen the election, even though we have the fucking proof that is the exact opposite of what happened. They tried the same shit in 1864, by the way. They accused Abe Lincoln of stealing that, but again, only to find out that they were doing the exact same shit there. But yeah,